This is the second recording of the Chapter 16 lecture notes, and I believe we left off with this slide, which is slide 14, talking about migration of organisms into and out of a population. So gene migration and gene flow are the same thing, and it just means that it's the movement of alleles between populations. And in plants, this would be when gametes, like pollen grains in plants contain the sperm. So when pollen grains or seeds are carried into another population by the wind, for example, or by, bees or birds or butterflies, other pollinators. But in animals, it would be when breeding individuals migrate into or out of the population. So this is called gene flow when this occurs. There is a concern with the use of genetically modified plants, like particularly crops, that the movement of the gene allows resistance to herbicides, especially if it travels to neighboring species. So it allows for weeds, for example, to become resistant to herbicides if they cross with the plants that have been genetically modified to be resistant to herbicide, so that you can spray a field and not kill the crops, but kill all the weeds. But there is a concern that the gene will somehow cross with the weeds that are that are there. And that they could become resistant. So, and then we have continual gene flow reduces genetic divergence between populations. So you have two different populations that are very different, have lots of genetic variation. Well, when you have continual gene flow between those populations, they're going to become more alike over time. And then if migration between populations doesn't occur, the gene pools become more different over time. That would be the opposite of that situation. The differences in the genetic makeup of these populations become so large that they become reproductively isolated and incapable of interbreeding. And this is the first step in the formation of a new species. And this is showing you gene flow between two populations of plants. This is the garden pea. Well, no, it isn't, because the garden pea is Pisum sativum, and this one is Pisum arvense. So you have to Google that one because I haven't, but it's definitely some type of a pea. It has the same looking flowers as the garden pea plant. So anyway, the pollen is able to travel by the wind and insect pollinators to the population across the river. So gene flow is occurring, and what this means is that over time, these populations will become more similar. Now, genetic drift is defined as the changes in allele frequencies of a population due to change rather than selection by the environment. This can occur after a bottleneck effect, where a large number of the population is wiped out, when severe inbreeding occurs, or when founders start a new population. The effect is stronger in small populations. So genetic drift, for example, here we have an example of this occurring. So we have these 10% of the population are these dark-colored moths. Then there's a forest fire that kills 5 of the light-colored moths. So now the population is composed of 20% dark moths. So it has significantly changed the allele frequencies in the population by wiping out a large number of the population. So that's an example of genetic drift. The bottleneck effect is a random event that prevents a majority of individuals from entering the next generation. So natural disasters or habitat loss can lead to the bottleneck effect. this is when the next generation is going to be composed of alleles that just happen to make it. So many times when only a few individuals of a population survive, the alleles that survive are not representative of the original population. Say, for example, you had a population of, I don't know why I've got this in my mind, but hair colors. So you have a population of redheads, blondes, and brunettes, and there is an equal number of all of them. So you end up having a natural disaster that wipes everybody out but the ones with the red hair. So your new population isn't going to have the brunettes or the blondes. It's just going to have a small number survived, and all the ones that survived had red hair, so they're not going to be representative of the original population. The founder effect is really similar to that. That's when you have a few individuals start a new population for whatever reason. And I just read a question about this in your quiz, in your Chapter 16 quiz, where the Viking explorers actually died, but had they lived, the Viking explorers would have basically started a new population, and there was just a few of them. So it would have been the founder effect, because the new population would be representative of the genetics of those few individuals, not the entire Viking population. So the alleles carried by a population founders, by the founders that leave the population and found a new population, are dictated by chance. The gene pool of the small population is typically much different from the gene pool of the original population. The greater the reduction in population size, the greater the effects on allele frequencies. So the smaller the size of the founder population, the greater the changes in the allele frequencies. This is also going to lead to a higher than normal occurrence of inbreeding, because there's so few individuals that the only way you're going to have offspring is with inbreeding. So you're going to have a higher occurrence of rare recessive disorders like cystic fibrosis or hemophilia more frequently in inbred populations. So this is an image that shows you what is meant by the bottleneck effect. You can look at the original population and the percentages of red, yellow, blue, and green marbles, right? So when you let them, when you pass them through a bottleneck, then the only ones that made it, there wasn't even any yellows. So it comes out that after the bottleneck effect, after this handful of marbles survives, that the offspring are going to be 44% green, 45% blue, 11% red, and no yellow. So the yellow, well, actually, somehow yellow came back in picture D, but I think I don't know why. I don't know if maybe yellow is a recessive or what, but bottom line is you can see in the ones that survived that there were no yellows here. So and there's a lot more green in comparison to the original population. So that's what a bottleneck effect is. It means that all these individuals left in the bottle die, and the ones that survive don't represent the allele frequencies of the original population. Okay, so non-random mating. When individuals don't choose their mates randomly, when they pick their mates, which is typically what happens. We don't randomly mate with whoever, most animals actually do choose their mates. So assortative mating is defined as this occurs when individuals select mates with the same phenotype with respect to a certain characteristic and reject mates with different phenotypes. It can play an important role in the evolution of a population. So we have an example on the island of, I guess you'd call that Pingelap. Non-random mating result in an increased frequency of color blindness. So People who are colorblind tended to mate with other colorblind individuals. And colorblindness is recessive, and it is sex-linked or X-linked. Okay, now this next section is on natural selection, which is another way to say that is survival of the fittest. It is the cause of evolution. It's the cause of new species forming. Or we could say evolution is caused by natural selection. But natural selection is the adaptation of a population to the biotic and abiotic environment. It requires variation. You cannot have natural selection if you don't have variation, because if you don't have some other trait to select, nature can't select another trait if there's not another trait, if that makes sense. So you have to have differences. You have to have mutations, and which cause variations in the members of the population. Then inheritance. Many differences are heritable genetic differences. You have to have differential adaptiveness. Some differences, some mutations will affect survivability. Some mutations are going to make it more likely that the organism survives, and some will make it less likely that the organism survives. Then we have differential reproduction, which means that some differences affect the likelihood of successful reproduction. Natural selection favors the variant that is most adaptive to the present environmental conditions. So you've got to have variations, and you've got to have some that are better for survival and reproduction and some that are worse. All right, there are 3 types of natural selection. There is stabilizing selection, in which the average trait is selected for. Most individuals have the average trait. And then there is directional selection, which can either go to the right or to the left of the curve, but it means that one of the extreme versions of the trait is selected for. And then disruptive selection, where the average is actually uncommon, but each extreme version of the trait would be selected for. So let's look at some examples. Most traits, like skin color and height and hair color and eye color, most traits are polygenic, and that means that they are controlled by many genes. So the variations in polygenic traits result in a bell-shaped curve, like you saw on the previous slide. In stabilizing selection, you will see that most individuals in the population will have the average trait. So an example are human babies and their birth weights. Human babies with a low birth weight or a high birth weight are not as likely to survive, but the average birth weight babies are more likely to survive. So that is an example of stabilizing selection. You can see that here, statistically proven here. Then directional selection is where an extreme phenotype is favored. When bacteria become resistant to antibiotics, the ones that have the resistant gene, that would be an extreme version of the trait. The average would be that they don't have the resistant gene. So when they have the resistant gene, they are selected for, and those are the ones that survive. So that would be one end of the curve. Disruptive selection is when the curve has 2 peaks, and an example are British land snails, and it has to do with their stripes. This shows you the selection of bacteria and their resistance to antibiotics. They're highly resistant to antibiotics over time. So the right end of the curve is selected for. In the beginning, you only had a few individuals resistant, and then you had a medium number of individuals, an average number of individuals, and now you have a large number that are resistant. With the snails, you can see the 2 varieties of snails, and they just have a different shell pattern. So the banding pattern tends to be more like the pattern on the left or the pattern on the right, and not a blending of the pattern, is how I'm interpreting this.